Okay, we are on to scholarly skepticism, a name that is my coinage, so don't go hunting in the literature for it or you'll find something random. But I needed something by which to distinguish a kind of skepticism that we find principally in two figures, David Friedrich Strauss and Ernst Renan, who don't quite fit the Hegelian mold of the Tübingen school. So I'm going to treat them separately, and today I'm going to focus on Strauss, and in particular on Strauss's first work, his Leben Jesu kritisch bearbeitet, his Life of Jesus critically worked at or worked over. I thought of two mottos for today's talk, and so I'm going to give you both of them before we plunge in. One is from Aristotle's Politics. Here and elsewhere, says Aristotle, we shall not obtain the best insights into things until we actually see them growing from the beginning. In deference to Aristotle, I'm going to take you through the origins of the kind of German skepticism which ultimately flower in Strauss so that you can see how he came to the position he did. Second quotation is from Butler's Analogy of Religion, very important work from the middle of the Deist Controversy in the 1730s. Butler is speaking of the cumulative nature of the evidences of Christianity, and he says, "It is obvious how much advantage the nature of this evidence gives to those persons who attack Christianity, especially in conversation. For it is easy to show in a short and lively manner that such and such things are liable to objection, that this and another thing is of little weight in itself, but impossible to show in like manner the united force of the argument in one view." That kind of piecemeal criticism we have already seen, particularly in Thomas Paine, but you'll see again how Strauss has a myopic approach. He's focused on details, and whether he's right or wrong about those, he just has no sense of the overall picture, and his critics will come and criticize him on just those grounds. Some characteristics of scholarly skepticism. It's centered in Germany, spreads outward from there. In its first phase, it's influenced very heavily by Hume and other deists like Tyndall, but relatively little by Hegel. There is some Hegelian influence. We'll talk more about that as we go along. Hegel obtained a university position in 1816, I believe. But the Hegelian influence is not as pronounced as it will be in the works of people like Bauer and his followers in the Tübingen tradition. It has roots, however, in earlier writers like Reimarus and Lessing. Strauss's Life of Jesus was translated into English by the novelist George Eliot, real name Marianne Evans. Evans had been raised an evangelical Methodist and fell into the company of Charles Hennell and his daughter Sarah and others of like mind, and lost her faith and became a sort of genteel freethinker. The second flowering of this kind of skepticism comes in books by Ernst Renan, like The Life of Jesus and The Apostles. We'll take a look at those on Thursday, if time permits. So I want to go back to someone who stands closer to the fountainhead of this kind of thing in Germany, and that's Hermann Samuel Reimarus. Reimarus, philosopher and theologian, he was the son-in-law of the German classical scholar Fabricius. So if you see references to Fabricius, there is that connection there. During his lifetime, he worked in various positions, finally became professor of Hebrew and Oriental languages at the high school, where he had himself, I believe, attended, and maintained that position despite invitations to go elsewhere. We are a long way from a world where high schools hire professors of Hebrew and Oriental languages. We can reflect on that some other time. During his lifetime, he wrote a manuscript which he circulated to a few family and friends, but he did not publish it, and that was his apology for, or some words in defense of, reasoning worshippers of God. It is, in effect, a work of deism. He rejects the New Testament accounts and the Old Testament accounts, particularly of miracles. He insists that inconsistencies in the narratives invalidate them as far as their historical worth. And you'll recognize in both of those moves that he makes the seeds of something that we see fully bloomed in Strauss. Parts of this work were published subsequently by Lessing, but without attributing them to Reimarus. His authorship of them became known only later. So let's have just a quick glance at Lessing. He was an influential German philosopher, playwright, and literary critic. He was a correspondent with Reimarus' daughter, published the fragments. When he published the Wolfenbüttel fragments, he came to the attention of the censor in Germany, who then stopped him from publishing any further theological works. Now, Lessing, of course, could say with some show of plausibility that he hadn't endorsed the fragments, he was merely publishing them, but the censor saw through that. So in response, Lessing wrote a play, Nathan the Wise, which he published in 1779. And that play has a story of 3 rings in it, and the 3 rings represent the 3 major monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And the moral of the story appears to be that none of these can claim to be the sole truth, and that the way to tell whether a man is right with God is not to look at his doctrine, but to look at his life, his manner of acting towards his fellow men. So for Lessing, Christianity is reduced to a set of moral precepts which may be useful for the right kind of person. Someone else might find other moral precepts useful as long as they broadly conform to what we can all sort of sense is right. Here are some things Reimarus has to say about miracles. I'm taking all of these quotations from an edition of the fragments published in the 1870s, edited by Charles Voysey. Voysey says that he did not translate them from the German. A friend of his did that, and he is merely editing them and presenting them, occasionally changing a bit of wording, but not the sense of it. So here are some quotations from Reimarus in Voysey's edition. To discover whether miracles are true requires as much investigation as the thing they are to prove. Therefore, if you wanted to prove something, why not just set out and do the work to establish it directly? Why take this trip round the barn trying to use miracles to do it? It's a circuitous way to try to arrive at something you should be able to demonstrate more directly. If you read the little piece on the spirit of truth and of power that we had from Lessing that sort of framed continental skepticism of a certain kind, you'll remember that Lessing also felt that appeal to miracles was a roundabout and dubious way of trying to establish things that, if they were true at all, ought to be visibly true. We should be able to see their truth directly. Again, after having ripped on some Old Testament miracles, he says, the miracles of the New Testament are not so outrageous and disgusting as those of the Old, but yet the writers entangle themselves hopelessly here and there in glaring contradiction, and nowhere do they accord to us a report of circumstances and reliable investigation from which one could judge whether the thing supposed to have happened was a bona fide miracle. So they're not as outrageous as Old Testament miracles tend to be, but still we can have no confidence in them. Conclusion he unsurprisingly draws from premises like these is that those who would build Christianity upon miracles give it nothing firm, deep, or substantial for a foundation. That phrase should set you thinking about some other writers, particularly some urbane critics like Matthew Arnold, who wanted to say there's something timeless, permanent, eternally valuable in Christianity, but miracles are the wrong way to establish it. They're the wrong kind of foundation to give it. What are the signs of truth and falsehood? Well, the unerring signs of truth and falsehood are clear, distinct consistency for truth and contradiction for falsehood. This is also the case with revelation insofar as that it must, in common with other truths, be free from contradiction. Now, you've seen similar statements in Paine and Strauss, and we'll talk a little bit about Norton's critique of Strauss later, but just note the blank way this is stated. Clear, distinct consistency and contradiction. How about prophecy? Well, Here's Reimarus on prophecy. If prophecy is to be called infallible, I fairly demand that it should state beforehand, legibly, clearly, and distinctly, that which no man could previously have known, and that the same should thereafter take place at the time appointed, but that it should not take place because it has been predicted. No fulfillment of the prophecy because you already know about the prediction. If, however, such a prophecy can only be verified through allegorical interpretation of words and things, if it can be only composed of dark and dubious words, and the expressions it contains are commonplace, vague, and uncertain, if the matter was thought probable, or was foreseen by human cunning, if it occurs because it was predicted, if the words used refer to some other matter and are only applied to the prophecy by a quibble, if it is only written down after the event has occurred, if a prophetic book or passage is given out to be older than it is, or lastly, if the thing predicted does not take place at all, then the prophecy is either doubtful or false. Very similar to some of the objections we saw in Ethan Allen the other day. Reimarus continues, if then we judge by these rules and commence an investigation of those Old Testament prophecies which have been applied to the New Testament, we shall find them to be worthless and false. Those examples which are most clearly expressed never came to pass. For example, that the Messiah should sit upon the seat of David on Mount Zion and reign from one sea to another, even unto the end of the world, and all besides that was prophesied of the deliverer of Israel. Old Testament prophecy understood literally didn't happen, therefore it's worthless as prophecy. Other prophecies are merely adapted through quibbles and in reality refer to quite other things. He's given a couple of examples. Later on, I will show that not a single sentence from the Old Testament applied by Matthew and others to the history of Jesus was written in the sense ascribed to it. Hold on to that thought that Reimarus is giving us there, that not a single sentence of the New Testament applies to the Old in a way that the Old meant it. You'll see this again as we're coming forward to look at the work of the establishment skeptics who wrote essays and reviews, and yet again in the work of the Dutch critic Kuenen, who is working in broadly parallel lines with the Tübingen School and takes Old Testament prophecy as his focus. Now, these kinds of objections had been addressed in the literature already, and Reimarus makes not the faintest attempt to engage with the responses given by people like Chandler or Bishop Kidder or other writers on Old Testament prophecy of time past. That doesn't mean he had not read them, but what he is doing here is not arguing for his position. He is simply stating his position. For his arguments, we are at a loss. We don't really have, except for a couple of examples, where he simply brushes aside the idea that these kinds of things can be properly interpreted. We don't really have the details of his arguments about any given passage. Next figure that we have to come to is Heinrich Paulus, the German theologian, taught at a succession of universities, finally at Heidelberg. He was the one who hired Hegel in 1816, and Paulus's work influenced Hegel's theology. Paulus is an example of what we would call the rationalist movement. This is the movement of those who attempted to read through the New Testament and interpret it as literally taking place, except where the miracles occur, and those are just honest mistakes. So, for example, in the feeding of the 5,000, perhaps Jesus preaching suppressed people's hunger. That and a few bag lunches shared around a little bit could give rise to the miracle story. Jesus walking on water. Well, maybe he was walking on the shore. The Sea of Galilee is not that big after all, and some people saw him walking by the shore. That would explain why they thought he was walking on the water, and so on. This kind of explanation became very popular for a brief time around the year 1800 and is a topic of merciless criticism by Strauss. He wants to go much further. He says this is silly, that's not what they meant. You can't really sincerely believe that honest men with working senses could be mistaken over and over again in these ways. No, it's all or nothing. We have to take this either as totally mythical or allow its literal truth, and we're not going to do that. So Paulus had several followers, and they are known collectively as the German rationalists. So that word rationalist has a very special meaning here. It does not mean people who believe that there's synthetic a priori knowledge. It's not a term in the Kantian tradition. It does not mean what it might mean later, which is full-blown skeptics. These guys actually thought of themselves as defending Christianity, but they pretty much explained away the supernatural aspect of it. Next person we want to look at is Friedrich Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher was a theologian, philosopher, a biblical scholar. He's often called the father of modern liberal theology, and his reputation for that rests in no small part on one book that he wrote in 1799, and then had several editions of this come out later in his life, on religion, speeches or discourses to its cultured despisers. Schleiermacher is concerned to save the essence of Christianity as you would want to save the kernel of wheat and discard the husk. So what's the kernel and what's the husk? Here's how he puts it. Religion is the outcome neither of the fear of death nor of the fear of God. It answers a deep need in man. It is neither a metaphysic nor a morality, but above all and essentially an intuition and a feeling. Not a morality, a feeling. Think here of Matthew Arnold talking about the eternal, that not ourselves, that makes for righteousness. Dogmas, teachings, are not, properly speaking, part of religion. Rather, it is that they are derived from it. Religion is the miracle of direct relationship with the infinite, and dogmas are the reflection of this miracle. Similarly, belief in God and in personal immortality are not necessarily a part of religion. One can't conceive of a religion without God, and it would be pure contemplation of the universe. The desire for personal immortality seems rather to show a lack of religion, since religion assumes a desire to lose oneself in the infinite rather than to preserve one's own finite self. Those of you who are looking forward to the section on transcendental skepticism in Ralph Waldo Emerson might want to make special note of this passage from Schleiermacher, because I think this expresses quite well something that Emerson himself is going to be displaying in his Divinity School address in the 1830s. And finally, with that background, we come to our man for the hour, David Friedrich Strauss, died in 1874. German theologian, he caused a scandal as a young man by the publication of his Life of Jesus. You'll notice that he's about 27 years old when that comes out. That went through 4 editions in his lifetime, was translated into English by Marianne Evans. Strauss was debarred from several teaching positions. He had an unhappy personal life. He married a woman who had been a famous actress, but the marriage was not a happy one, and they separated and divorced. He continued to write polemical pieces and a new life of Jesus for the German people, not directed at scholars, but directed at the common man, and ended his days avowing very directly that Christianity was false and that the choice was between Christianity and a special form of atheism which had finally been given its true shape in the teaching of Charles Darwin. To get the timeline here, remember that Darwin published his Origin of Species in 1859. So, smack in the middle of his life, Strauss encountered Darwin, and when he did, he might have said, in the words that Richard Dawkins has subsequently used, that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. But at the period at which he wrote his Life of Jesus, and for the time of several of its republications, he was not an atheist, he was a pantheist. along the lines of Spinoza. And he speaks glowingly about the truth of Christian religion, which, however, like Schleiermacher, he says is not connected with any actual doctrines. Strauss approaches the New Testament text in his Life of Jesus with two principles in hand. And we can find these in the edition of Strauss that I was having you do for reading this weekend on pages 87 and 88, as well as in some other places. That an account is not historical, that the matter related could not have taken place in the manner described, is evident, first, when the narration is irreconcilable with the known and universal laws which govern the course of events. Strauss does not name David Hume here in this book, but in his new Life of Jesus, he does explicitly draw attention to both Spinoza and Hume and say, this is why we cannot take seriously any account that tells us that there has been a violation of the universal laws which govern the course of events. Why are we so stuck on those laws? Well, long, patient scientific work has disclosed to us these laws. We finally stand, had he been a Darwinist at this time, he would have said at the pinnacle of evolution, we finally have come to the realization that the universe is causally closed. Determinism is true, and there is no exception, there is no escape from the chain of cause and effect. Those of you who have read C.S. Lewis will remember that Lewis, in one of his books, has a chapter on the cardinal difficulty of naturalism. It's in his book on miracles, where he points out that if you really take a thoroughgoing deterministic naturalism to be your doctrine, then you get rid of a whole lot of things, including your justification for believing naturalism. That's a line of argument that becomes popular just after the end of the time period that we're dealing with here, but it's worth seeing its seeds here in Strauss and Dolbach and other writers as well. Secondly, an account which shall be regarded as historically valid must neither be inconsistent with itself nor in contradiction with other accounts. That criterion is phrased somewhat carelessly, because, of course, I can sit down and on the back of a napkin write out an account that contradicts something else, and I can't thereby undermine the authority of Josephus or Tacitus. It has to be that we have two accounts and they come to us equally well credentialed. Then when they contradict one another, on the point where they're in contradiction, we are left in doubt, because we have what appears to be an equally good case for both sides of the question. We've seen this now in Paine, we've seen this in Reimarus, the criterion that two accounts must be consistent if they are true. And that's going to cause quite a bit of difficulty when we come to trying to look at secular history. Andrews Norton in particular is going to press very hard on that point. Well, let's see an application of this. The very first story that Strauss tries to take on is the story of the birth of John the Baptist. Some unknown figure wrote that story or told that story first, and in his mind, according to Strauss, he had a kind of amalgamation of bits and pieces of the Old Testament put together in a composite image. Here's how it's supposed to have worked. Isaac's parents in the Old Testament were advanced in age when they were promised a son. This suggested that John's parents should be likewise. Abraham expresses his doubt aloud. Hence, this author made Zacharias ask as well. According to the Septuagint, Aaron's wife's name was Elizabeth. This suggested a name for John's mother. Samson, hey, wow, we're jumping around a lot, aren't we? Samson's birth was announced by an angel. He therefore provided an angel to announce John's birth. According to popular Jewish ideas, angels tended to appear to priests in the temple, thus the location for the appearance to Zacharias. Samson was to be raised under a Nazirite vow. This circumstance suggested both the nature of John's education and the blessings his birth would confer upon his country. Samuel's birth called forth a lyric poem of thanks and praise. Thus, Zacharias' effusion on the occasion of John's circumcision. Isaiah was commanded to write the name of his son, Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, on a tablet. This circumstance suggested a similar provision of a writing surface for Zacharias, to give the name of the child. Many of the Jews believed that when any man saw a divine vision, he lost the use of one of his senses for a time. Hence, the inability of Zacharias to speak after his expression of doubt and question. So that, and now we're at direct quotation from Strauss, page 107, so that we stand here upon purely mythical poetic ground, the only historical reality which we can hold fast as positive matter of fact being this: the impression made by John the Baptist by virtue of his ministry and his relation to Jesus was so powerful as to lead to the subsequent glorification of his birth in connection with the birth of the Messiah in the Christian legend. I have tried to give what I think is a fair representation of Strauss's position here, but it's worth our stopping here to ponder a question that would be the question many of Strauss's critics would raise, and it's simply this: what historical narrative is there anywhere that could not be dissolved using such methods? Or to put the question differently, can we actually explain a prima facie historical narrative by finding parallels for bits and pieces of it scattered across the wide surface area of a document as large as the Old Testament? Is that really an act of explanation? Or are we simply falling prey to parallelomania in doing that? Strauss has no question. He says he is explaining these things, and this is, moreover, the scientific way to explain things. Why does he think that this is science? What makes this kind of explanation a scientific explanation? Well, what makes it scientific is that this is the way that Strauss and his fellow scholars were trained to explain away Greek myths. So, if the Greeks and the Phrygians had enmity with one another and had stories about the defeat of each other's gods, then this can be traced back to some innocuous bit of disagreement that they had regarding, say, musical instruments. The Greeks preferring one and the Phrygians preferring another, and as a result of that disagreement, the myth grows up that one god, the Greek god, has defeated the Phrygian god, and it all grows out of this tiny nucleus, and we get bits and pieces of the myth which we then try to farm out in this mythical way. So this word mythos, which he's using constantly, was big at the time, and it was so because that was the popular way of trying to account for the origin of pagan mythology. Strauss is simply more thoroughgoing in his application of it, and he is nothing if not assiduous. He takes his time, he marshals together a numbing array of claims, and then he laboriously writes them all out. And Norton actually makes fun of his prolixity, his tendency to write almost interminably when he could have said what he had to say much more concisely. Did any of you feel like that as you were reading through Strauss? Right, okay. One of the people that I've had you read a bit of is Andrews Norton, who responded to Strauss vigorously in a work that he was working on at the time of his death. His son, Charles Eliot Norton, himself a notable writer, published this after his father's death. He was a Unitarian scholar and professor at Harvard. He clashed with Ralph Waldo Emerson, and their clash pretty much split the Unitarian movement down the middle. Certainly no conservative. Andrews Norton rejected most of the Old Testament miracles. He also rejected the virgin birth because he thought the first 2 chapters of the Gospel of Matthew were spurious. But he vigorously opposed Strauss and others who were influenced by German thought because he maintained that the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus is very strong and is, in fact, the anchor point of the Christian faith. Now, Today, when Unitarianism is almost synonymous with complete lack of belief in any doctrine whatsoever, it may seem curious to look at somebody like Norton and think of him as a defender of a central Christian miraculous claim. But this has been a characteristic of the Unitarians for a long time. We can actually trace this back into, at least the 17th century, when the Rakovian Catechism was circulated among the Polish Socinians. They did not believe in the deity of Christ, so they were Unitarians themselves. And yet the Rakovian Catechism, if you compare it with the Heidelberg Catechism or other catechisms at the time, the Belgic Confession, the Rakovian Catechism contains the most explicit, detailed, unsparing, historical defense of the bodily resurrection of Jesus of any catechism of the time. It goes out of its way in this respect. So there was at the beginning this strand in Unitarianism which, denying various other cardinal doctrines of Christian faith, held very tightly to the resurrection, and Norton stands foursquare in that tradition. In fact, Norton was so distressed with what some of his fellow scholars at Harvard were doing, people like Emerson and Ripley, that he actually went to Charles Hodge and other scholars at Princeton and asked their permission for him to republish some of their essays criticizing his Unitarian colleagues and German skepticism in general in order to help combat this. And they agreed. So there's a little booklet out there with some of these papers. In fact, someone at Hodge, I believe it was, said to him, well, yeah, you're welcome to do that. There is a passage in that paper in which I just, in passing, criticize you as well. I'm happy to cut that passage out for republication. And Norton said, no, I will publish the whole paper. I'm not worried about or afraid of being criticized by any Christian man. That's fine. I'm willing to let that stand. I want the whole paper. And so he published the whole thing. So there's a very curious alliance going on between Norton and the more orthodox scholars at Princeton at this time. There's much more that we could say about Norton, and maybe we'll talk about that in a little while when we get to the Q&A, since you have read some of Norton already. One other, here, I'll just read his summary from his internal evidences. My purpose has been to make it evident that this sort of criticism is inapplicable to human testimony. He's particularly concerned with Strauss's attempt to pick holes in things by noticing minute discrepancies, arguing from silences, and so forth. Inapplicable to human testimony, to profane history equally as to the Gospels, and that its results have no tendency to invalidate the essential truth of any narrative subjected to it. I speak of that spurious criticism which, setting aside all the knowledge respecting the fallibility and inaccuracy of human testimony that experience is continually teaching us, represents it as an objection to the essential truth of an account found in the narratives of different writers, that these narratives do not agree with each other in all their parts, that they are more or less encrusted with errors of various kinds, and that none of them is without flaws. Truth is not dug from the mine of history as one entire and perfect chrysolite, any more than it is so found in the everyday relations of common life. Different original accounts of the same series of events, when they agree in the main facts but are inconsistent in minor particulars, confirm each other, since they show that the narrators give independent testimony and had each separate sources of information. While on the contrary, were it possible to find different accounts professedly original perfectly agreeing in all their details, this would be a phenomenon hitherto so unknown as either to justify the suspicion of collusion in the writers, or to lead at once to the inference that we had in fact but the testimony of one witness whom the others had copied. Three things come to mind there. One is the rather similar statement that William Paley makes in his view of the evidences of Christianity, that the ordinary character of human testimony is substantial truth under circumstantial variety. Another is the fact that Thomas Starkey, the eminent legal scholar, quotes Paley in his practical treatise on the law of evidence, and I think that John put that up in the group last time. We don't have that in the database, but we can give you a Google link to Starkey on Evidence, if you like, where he directly engages with Hume. And the third is that other writers like Whately and Eberhard are largely coming from a position where they say small discrepancies are just inconsequential. We get them everywhere. Maybe there could be a resolution of them, but it's not worth trying to descend to the point of defending every particular alleged error from this charge. James Orr says in his book on Revelation and Inspiration, even though he thinks many of the charges are spurious, he says to try to make the absolute infallibility of the narrative the main point is suicidal. You'll never get anywhere because you'll just forever be addressing objection after objection, whereas the substantial truth should be the main thing that we're going for first. So various writers of more or less orthodox persuasion who would probably not have been comfortable taking it as far as Norton does still maintain that the substantial truthfulness and the independence of the writers can be seen from the very diversity of the way that they record things. So passages in Watson as well will come to mind. Talk more about Thomas Cooper, I hope, later this week. But Cooper's a really interesting fellow in connection with Strauss. English lecturer, political reformer, self-educated savant. Cooper's father died when he was extremely young. He was apprenticed to, I believe, a cobbler and had little formal education. There's very rarely been such a mismatch between ability and opportunity. When he got access to the British Library, he started reading through vast swaths of it. He taught himself 13 languages. Was a lecturer on a staggering array of topics. He was also a chartist, a member of an early movement for the rights of factory workers. And in 1842, he gave a passionate speech about the exploitation of the workers and the need for reform in the working conditions, and such reforms did eventually come. However, after he gave the speech, some people, roused to a frenzy, went off and burnt down some houses, and they couldn't catch the perpetrators, but everybody knew Cooper had given the speech, so they threw him in jail. Everyone agreed that he had not actually engaged in the destruction of property. He maintained stoutly that he had never encouraged anyone to destroy property and would not have encouraged them to destroy property, but there it was. In jail, he went through a very dark time. He read Strauss's Life of Jesus in German before it had been translated into English, because German was one of the languages he had taught himself. Lost his faith. He had been a Methodist lay preacher, but he had had some run-ins with a superintendent who was jealous of his popularity as a speaker. And in jail, he lost his faith. In 1850, he was back out of jail and publishing Cooper's Journal, in which he was taking the main lines of Strauss's arguments and recapitulating them for an English working man's audience. And they were quite popular and caused a bit of distress among the clergy in London, seeing that their parishioners were suddenly coming up with Strauss's arguments. But he had doubts about his doubts. Even though he moved in the same circles as Bradlaugh and Holyoake, he never took an antagonistic position toward the person of Jesus. He always maintained that Jesus was a holy and righteous man, and at one point he actually was engaging in some correspondence with a clergyman, and he said, can you bring me to Christ? Him I want. If the Gospels prove to be half legend, still I want him. But why is it that I am still so full of doubts? In 1855, his doubts about his doubts were resolved. He reconverted to Christianity, identified himself with a Baptist, was baptized by Charles Haddon Spurgeon. and spent the last 30 years of his life giving almost 7,000 lectures and sermons on the evidences of Christianity, crisscrossing England, traveling by rail and by coach from one end of it to the other, never charging a fee for his lectures. We have some publications in which he has given us the substance of the lectures he gave. This bit that I'll quote in a minute is drawn from them. First of all, just to get a sense of how wide his reading was. He made a living when he was not a Christian by giving lectures on European political developments, on injustice in Ireland, on the literary genius of Shakespeare, Milton, Burns, Byron, schools of painters, Italian, Dutch, Flemish, Spanish, French, English, the music of Handel, Haydn, Mozart, Mendelssohn, Beethoven, a 10-lecture series on the history of Greece, 17 lectures on the history of Rome, 51 lectures on the history of England, philosophy, geology, astronomy, natural history, ancient Egypt, modern Poland, Muhammad, Swedenborg. He was a broad-gauge guy. And in his popular lectures on the evidences of Christianity after his reconversion, you'll see bits and pieces of this vast reading coming in. He knows how to keep the attention of an audience while at the same time giving them something out of the store of his copious reading. Here's what Cooper said about Strauss, and remember, Strauss is the one who was instrumental in his own loss of faith, and so it's really interesting to see what he has as a reconvert to say in response. This is from The Bridge of History, which was a set of lectures that he gave many times. What is it, I ask again, that Strauss affirms? Nobody knows who wrote the four Gospels. Nobody knows where they were written or when they were written. I say, again, that when Strauss affirms that nobody knows who wrote the Gospels, he cannot mean that they are anonymous books, books without authors' names. He knows that they are called the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Then what does he mean? I ask again, does he mean that supposing they really are the right names, yet the names are worthless to us, for nobody knows who these people were? They are mere men in the moon, there is no historical identity about them, there is nothing on record to connect them with the history they narrate, if it be a history. But if this be really what Strauss means, the simple reply is, it is not true. And then he takes his listeners through a sort of short tour of some of the evidences brought forward in Paley's evidences, in the writings of Lardner and his credibility of the gospel history, in some of the writings of Brooke Faust Westcott. And he names these people in his introduction. And he says, if anything in this book should make readers want to go and investigate more deeply in these books, then by all means, I encourage you to do so. So he's pushing his audience, originally his listeners, then his readers, to study some of these older, substantial works on the evidences of Christianity.